can't tell, I'm recovering from a cold, which is why my voice sounds a little bit strange, but most people are like, yeah, whatever. So yes, it's been a while. We had guest speakers for the past couple weeks, and so honestly, whenever I don't speak for a couple weeks, it's just like, I feel off. And I'm like, oh man, like, it's hard again. What's going on? But yeah, I'm excited for us to get back into the Word, excited for us to get back into the book of Exodus. And so we're back into chapter 9. We're in the middle of the plague. So for those of you that are here for the first time or haven't been here for a while, we're in the middle of like all the bad stuff. We're like, oh, all this crazy stuff's going on. So in that, let's get straight into it. So it looks like I'm not getting the connection. Sarah, can you unplug that and plug that back in real quick? The dongle. Yeah, the dongle. Yes. Plug it out, plug it back in. Still not working. Okay, I'm going to need your help. Next slide, please. All right, so question I want to start off with today is, have you ever felt like, that time you're like, wow, nature is bigger than me? Have you ever been in that type of situation? Anyone want to venture any time where they realize that you're powerless to nature? Anybody? Give me an example. Go ahead, Cal.
There was a time when I was on a ship, and it was just like in the middle of the ocean. I saw like how big the ocean was. It was like really heavy as well. And just like you can't see anything, especially it was during nighttime.
So you were in a little boat,
Yeah.
in the middle of the ocean, and you realized how infinitely small you were, right? Okay. Little Calvin in a boat. Anything else? Any other examples where nature just put you in awe, or you were just like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna die?
Summer.
What was that?
Those ice skating, Cal?
Ice skating?
Yeah.
How is ice skating nature related?
Oh,
It's man-made ice rink.
I don't tripped on ice before.
You tripped on ice.
And then I tried to get up and I fell again.
So was it like a comedy where you're like whoop, 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 and you just like keep falling down? You almost cried? Was this recent, bro?
No.
Okay. All right. Any other examples?
I couldn't stop a fire.
You could. What? When was this?
When I was a kid.
What'd you burn?
The carpet.
Oh, like in your house?
Yeah.
Wow. So like fire extinguisher later and stuff
No,
like that.
I called Catherine.
So your sister took care of it.
No.
No?
No, I took care of it in the end.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. So fire. All right. So I think all of us have some type of experience. For me, a lot of it, like Justin, deals with ice. Especially, I drive enough that you know that eerie feeling when you realize your car, you're not in control of it anymore, right? When you're driving in the rain, you have hydroplaning when you're going too fast, and you're on like a sheet of water, and your car is like starting to spin. That's always a bad feeling. But the worst is when you hit ice, because there's like nothing you can do. And I think it was it the sophomore year when I was in college? I was driving back up to school, and I hit it was an ice storm, and I was driving sort of recklessly, I guess. I learned later not to drive the way I was driving, but I hit a patch of like black ice, and my car started to fishtail, and I realized that if I kept fishtailing, I was going to go into the other lane, and there's a car behind me. So I knew that I wasn't supposed to hit the brake, because the last thing you ever want to do when you're on ice is touch the brake, because then you lose absolute control. But I freaked out, and I tapped the brake, and then my car went off the road. I heard like all the I could tell my car was like hitting like grass and stuff like that, because I could hear it. And all of a sudden, boop, like I was upside down. So my car went off the road. The corner of my car hit the corner of a hill and popped me over. And then I'm upside down, which is a weird feeling when you're in a car, because like the seatbelt is keeping me up. Then I undid the seatbelt, hit my head on the ceiling. Totally totaled the car. It was a sad day, and it was actually the first time my parents saw the campus of my university, because they were dropping me off after my car was wrecked. But anyway, that was just one of the examples where I felt powerless to nature, and I'm sure many of you have other examples, but we'll get into that later. Let's get into the text. Next slide, please. Sarah, you're going to be busy for now. Okay. Exodus 9. Open up your smartphones, Bibles, or look at the screen. Exodus 9, starting from verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, that my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. The Lord set a time and said, tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land. And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh investigated and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on people and animals throughout the land. So they took soot from a furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on people and animals. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils that were on them and on all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth, but I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You will... I guess it's working now. Hold on a sec. Where are we? You will set yourself against my people, thank you, Steve, and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. But those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky so that hail will fall all over Egypt, on people and animals and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. The only place it did not hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. This time I have sinned, he said to them. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer. Moses replied, when I have gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail. So you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God. The flax and barley were destroyed, since the barley had headed and the flax were in bloom. The wheat and spelt, however, were not destroyed because they ripened later. Then Moses left Pharaoh and went out of the city. He spread out his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. Amen. Long passage. Again, a reminder that our theme for this year is the gospel of freedom, and understanding that through the gospel that God intends us to live lives with more freedom, that whatever burdens, whatever bondages that we might feel that we are under, whatever oppression that might be, that we would experience more freedom from that this year. Now, we've been going through the book of Exodus, and we've seen throughout all this hardship that really the hero of the story has been God. But he has chosen to use a very flawed vessel in Moses. But even so, what we're starting to see is God has pit himself against Pharaoh, and he says, give me my people so that they can worship and serve me. And Pharaoh says, no, I don't know God. I don't know the Lord. And so now we are going into these plagues, and really the thing I want you to understand about these plagues is the main purpose is for God to be known. Not just to the Israelites, not just to the Egyptians, but to the entire world. All the people all around the world will always know what God did to the Egyptians. And so his intention is to make his name known, but also to keep his promise. The promise that he had made 400 years earlier, that he would free these people and give them a land later on. So the purpose behind this isn't just to beat down on the Egyptians. The purpose behind this is for God to be glorified, and for him to also show grace and mercy on his people. So, now 2 weeks ago I titled the sermon Icky Things, because we had what? We had frogs, we had gnats, we had flies. These are kind of gross, icky things. And you know, at the end of the day, these are things that were more of a nuisance, right? If you had a bunch of frogs, it would be gross, but you would still live. If you had all these gnats around you, again, that would be gross, but you could still live. You have all these flies around you, it would be a real pain in the butt, but it wasn't anything that was life-threatening. Now things are starting to shift. We're going from the icky to what I call the destructive. Now we're actually seeing death, and we're seeing like things actually getting completely wiped out. Now, this is probably a little bit hard to read, but as I talked to you about before, there's a pattern, a cycle in these plagues. That there's first Pharaoh, go to Pharaoh in the morning, and then there's go to Pharaoh, and then there's this immediate plague. And we see this cycle that started first with the Nile, and then the frogs and gnats. That's the first set of 3. The next set of 3 are the flies, livestock, and boils. And now we see the hails is go to Pharaoh in the morning. In the go to Pharaoh in the morning, those are the long ones. So those are the ones that there's a very long discussion between Moses and Pharaoh, and there's a lot of detail in particularly the ones in the morning. The second ones, there's another shorter dialogue. The immediate ones, there's no dialogue. It just goes immediately to a plague. And so we see this cycle again and again, and it's kind of interesting, but the feeling that you get from this is that these plagues are coming from left and right. We don't it doesn't really seem like one ends and the next starts. It's like they're constantly coming. And there are different things that God is intending to do with these things. So I want you to understand that we are on this part of the cycle, livestock, boils, and hail. This is nerdy stuff. You don't have to pay too much attention to this. Just know that this is the cycle that's going on. Now, we start off with livestock. So this is a very old etching of what that was like, with a bunch of animals just dying immediately, right? And so you have like cattle dying, you have horses that are having a hard time, and like people were like, holding their nose because it's smelly. Regardless, this first plague is a bunch of animals dying. Now, for us in these days, animals don't really carry as much value to the modern person, right? Now, I know some of you have pets. I know Namu is here somewhere. So I'm sure Mallory would be really sad if Namu all of a sudden just died. But for most of us, animals aren't a natural part of our lives. But back then, that was one of the greatest things of value that they owned. Aside from land and your own family, livestock was the next thing of value, right? So people, they measured their value in the amount of livestock that they had. And so to suddenly lose all this livestock was huge. Not only that, like this, well, I'll get into it in a second, but this first plague is all of a sudden, we saw a lot of annoying things, but now we are seeing God actually destroying creation itself. He's killing animals, right? And these are animals of great value and of great worth. And as I said before when we were going back into this, when you look at the plagues as a whole, it is an act of decreation. God is essentially going backward in creation and destroying things. But he's doing this with a purpose, to make himself known and to free his people. We see the contrast to that in Jesus Christ. The contrast to Jesus Christ is he is going to die for the sake of bringing life and freedom to others. Now, again, I like to tell you about who are the different gods that are being attacked. There are many different gods of Egypt. The one that links most closely to livestock is Hathor. It's a she, and so she's the goddess of love. Like maybe people compare her to like Aphrodite or Venus for like Roman or Greek mythology. And apparently she was represented in this big cow, and that's Pharaoh underneath of her, just enjoying the milk of Hathor. And so she's the goddess of love. And so this is who God is attacking. He is challenging the livestock, the livelihood of Egypt. And so what happens here is it's not just animals dying. This messed up their economy. This messed up a big source of food for them, and even their transportation. Right? This is the country where you got around in camels. Joyce, you've ridden a camel before, right?
I ate one.
You ate one. Okay. She doesn't ride them; she eats them. I had camel hump in China once. It was kind of chewy. But anyway, so this one act, this one plague, would have crippled a country. And so this is what's going on. Egypt is threatened. Their economy, their food, and their transportation. But at the end of the day, what we see in Pharaoh is his heart was still unyielding. Even though God had given this big blow, he's like, you know what? I'm not going to let them go. And so then we go into boils. Now, I could have put up some disgusting pictures, and I chose not to because they're really gross. This is just a very simple medical picture of what a boil looks like, or what is also known as a skin abscess or skin abscess. They're different from pimples, by the way. They're much more painful, but basically what happened was there was this soot that was thrown into the air, so people's bodies were covered in boils. And we see this also in the book of Job. Job also suffers this experience, or he goes through this experience himself as well. This is a very painful thing. And it's gross. Right? You look disgusting. There's all this pus coming out. It's a very horrible experience to go through. But this is entirely... oh man. They're having all sorts of technical difficulties. Battery died. Sorry, guys. We're gonna fight through this. Okay. What else can go wrong? Okay, boils are gross and painful, and this is what everyone but the Israelites. If you really look closely in the text, it only says the Egyptians were afflicted with this, right? But ironically, here we go. There are two different goddesses that this might have been. Now, Isis is not the Islamic State in Syria. This is the goddess Isis, who's the goddess of health. And Sekhmet is like the goddess of curing or something like that. We're not really sure exactly who it is. But again, the Egyptians were really big on hygiene. Really big on hygiene. To the point where, if you were seen as physically unclean, if there are any blemishes on you, you weren't actually allowed to go into the temple to worship. If you're a priest and you had a pimple on your face, you couldn't actually do your job until you were clean, right? This is a very hygienic society. Maybe not anymore, but it was back then. But ironically, this all starts from a furnace. Why is this important? If you go all the way back to chapter 1 and chapter 2, the Israelites were called to make bricks. And they fired these bricks in these same furnaces. So God is going back to the same injustice that the Israelites were doing, and he was using this to inflict this plague upon these people. It comes from a furnace. It comes from the soot of a furnace. And then here, whenever you see the immediate plague, the first immediate plague was the gnats, right? You guys remember the gnats? The gnats was the third plague, and that was the first plague that the magicians could not replicate. And then they're getting attacked by these gnats, and they're like, this is the finger of God, right? So the magicians got owned then. This is the final time they get owned. You never hear from them after this passage. They get attacked by these boils and they run away and they can't stand before Moses and Pharaoh. The reason why is because now they are physically unclean. So they literally can't go into Pharaoh's presence anymore until these boils go away. And what we guess is you never hear from them again, so they're probably covered in boils until the very end of the storm, right? Who knows? But they get owned again. And what this also does is this completely disrupts worship. Because these were the people that led these temple services. Now all of a sudden, they can't even go into the temple. So this, not only, like the first plague, or the plague that I just talked about before, livestock disrupted the economy, now worship is disrupted. But the interesting thing about this passage is, it actually says, God hardens the heart of Pharaoh. Okay? It will say this again later, but this is the first time it shows up in the text, that it's not necessarily Pharaoh's heart that is hardening, it is actually the Lord hardening his heart. We'll touch upon that again later, because it's going to happen again. But I want you to see that God is also involved in this process. And then lastly, we get to hail. Any of you guys ever been in a hailstorm? Oh, quite a few of you guys. So as you can see, they can get pretty big. So you see in this is from Australia down there. It can get big enough to destroy like cars like that, like to go through windshields. I think it can get up to generally the size of about a grapefruit, chamo. I think the largest on record was about, 8 inches? Which is like 160 centimeters or something like that. But regardless, like it can get really big. And what happens is, this is a picture of a hailstorm in Russia at a beach. This happened a couple years ago. Actually, unfortunately, a couple kids died during this. But this is in warm weather, right? So what happens is hail, it doesn't matter how cold it is outside. It's basically the system where there's a storm coming, and then there's an updraft that pulls things back up and creates ice in the sky that rains down, right? And these ice vary in size. And the weird thing is, the places where I've experienced hail the most are not cold places. It happened to me when I was in Texas. Right? Texas is not a cold place. Like, why is ice coming from the sky in Texas? I don't understand. But that's where I experienced hail the most, was in Texas. Now, there's one story I like to tell for a different reason, because I'll tell it quickly, but I've told this before, but basically, there was one summer where I was kind of the engineer that everyone knew, if you were going on a summer mission trip, I was going to give you money, right? And so there are a lot of campus, I was at a campus ministry, so a lot of college students came up to me, basically begging me for money. This one summer, I gave away too much. I looked at my bank account, I'm like, oh man, I'm in trouble, like, I'm too generous, like what's going on? And I was like, oh no, I started doing the math, and I knew that toward the end of the year, I was going to have difficulties. But oddly enough, I was called on a business trip for work to Asia. So I actually came over here to China, Korea, and Japan for about a month. And I was like, okay, that's good. My company will pay for my food, so that'll help me with my expenses for a little bit, but I'll just go on this trip and come back. So I go on this business trip, I come back, and I know that like, I'm still expecting some type of financial difficulties when I come back. So I come back, and don't think anything of it, and then someone's like, hey, you know what? It hailed in your neighborhood while you were gone. I was like, what are you talking about? And so I looked at my car, and I didn't notice anything, but then when I looked at it at a certain angle, I could see little like bumps all over the car. I was like, oh, I got hailed on. What do I do? He said, go to your insurance company. So I was State Farm Insurance. Right? So I go to my insurance agent, and they're like, oh, take your car into the shop. Like they had their own shop, and we'll give it an appraisal. And so I take it there, and they look at it, and they basically look at it, and they start writing me a check. And I'm like, what is that? And they're like, oh, this is the amount that will cover the damages minus your deductible. And it's like $2,500, something like that. And I was like, what do I do with this? They're like, well, you can get it fixed, or you do whatever you want. And I looked at it, I was like, that's like 40% of the value of the car. so I'm like, thank you, Lord. And then I was worried that my insurance would go up, right? So I asked the agent, I was like, hey, is this going to increase my premium? They're like, oh no. I was like, why not? This is an act of God. So even Even State Farm Insurance recognizes that hail is an act of God, brothers and sisters. So that's the whole reason why I told the story. But even when I was in Texas, when I was driving once in northern Dallas, I was on my way to a conference, and we're having all sorts of difficulties today. Please don't stare, you might have an epileptic seizure. But I remember when I was driving in northern Dallas for this conference, it was all of a sudden this huge rainstorm came, and it turned into hail. And so that was my first experience being in the car while it was hailing. And it feels like you're in a war zone. Right? You see, like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die. Like it literally feels like the heavens are attacking you. Right? That is what hail feels like. So if you are not under shelter, you are in big trouble because you cannot avoid this ice raining down from the heavens. So brothers and sisters, hail is no joke. So when the Bible says that everything that was going to be outside of shelter was going to be destroyed, it's true. When hail is that strong, it will destroy everything that's outside. Now here we have the goddess of the sky, Nut. She's actually one of the most important goddesses. She's like kind of one of the top 5 among the Egyptian gods. And you'll see as we continue in the story that the level of the god increases to the most important one, who's during darkness. But regardless, Nut is the goddess of the sky. And she was supposed to protect, so she's protecting Egypt with her whole body. But unfortunately, God turns it around, and now the heavens are attacking this nation. And so here is an interesting part in this passage where Moses says to Pharaoh, "For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." Basically what God is saying through Moses here is, you can see by my power, I could have just destroyed you all, and it would have been over, right? I am that powerful. But I have raised you up just for this very purpose. Think about what that is saying. When you look at history, history generally tends not to make that much sense. I'm a big history buff. I love history. That was my favorite subject. It was the elective I always took in college. I love history because you can see things from a very broad perspective. But generally speaking, a lot of important events that happen in history don't make sense unless, to me, you look at it through the lens of God. Now when God is basically saying, I raised you up for this very purpose, think about what that really means. Egypt is one of the earliest and greatest civilization this world has ever known, right? Scientifically, they were advanced. We look at the pyramids and the Sphinx and all this, and we're like, how did people do something like this? This is crazy. This is an amazing civilization. So much so that many people speculate aliens helped them. Right? That's a very common thought. Is that like normal people can't do this, so you know what? Aliens came down and taught them how to do this. This is a lot of people think this. But what I'm saying instead is, God raised them up, allowed them to become this amazing civilization, so that they could have this encounter with Israel. And so that through this encounter, through God going through these plagues and disciplining what it was at the time the greatest civilization the world had ever known, it was just for that purpose. There are other times in history that are just like this. You look at Rome, I talk about this a lot too. The Roman civilization doesn't make that much sense. They weren't that smart, right? Like if I were to make the modern day analogy, the Greeks were the Steve Jobs. They were Apple, right? Greeks were geniuses. They would come up with, they were very innovative. They were making these iPhones and iPods and all these crazy things. The Romans, all they could do was take other people's ideas and just tweak it a little bit. They were Bill Gates. They were Microsoft, right? They weren't that innovative, but they knew how to adjust things a little bit and make it a little bit better. And so the Romans came to power while the Greeks fell. And so, Rome became the greatest empire the world had ever known, right? This Pax Romana, right? But then after like not too long after it became Christianized, completely crumbled to like German barbarians. Like what? How did the greatest civilization the world knew fall to these wimpy barbarians? But when you actually really think about history, it almost seems to me that God raised up Rome so that there would be paths in which his gospel, his story of Jesus Christ could like roam freely, right? The Pax Romana meant safety, it meant roads, it meant free passage, and that is what allowed missions, right? If it was like a bunch of different kingdoms and you can't enter into other ones, there's no concept of missions. But brothers and sisters, my argument, and I'm taking kind of a side point with this, is that God uses history. God allows certain things to rise and fall for his purpose. But it's impossible for us to see that when we're stuck in the moment. Because just like a grand painting, when you're in this little small pixel and you see the paintbrush stroke, you don't understand the purpose behind it. But when you step back and you see the entire canvas, all of a sudden you see something beautiful and amazing. But for us, we are oftentimes stuck in that little pixel. And so what I'm saying with all this is, even when we talk about today's history, trust in God. He is allowing things to happen for a particular purpose. And some people are like, oh my gosh, Trump is president. You're like, the world is over. Or maybe vice versa. You're like, hey, Trump, yay. Well, regardless of whatever your opinion is, God is still in control. Even with like Korea, Park Geun-hye, and all the crazy things that happened over the past couple of years, I truly believe God has a purpose for them. So we need to trust in him. Because he allows people to rise and fall for his own glory, for his own purpose. So even when things seem crazy, and I know they do even now, like, all this North Korea stuff and all the scares that we're hearing right now, brothers and sisters, just trust in God. Let him do what he's going to do. Now when we go back to this hail, the interesting thing here is not just the Israelites, but also the officials that feared the Lord, they were spared too, because they went back, they took their slaves, they took their remaining livestock, and they put them under shelter. So we're seeing a different distinction. God doesn't just give relief to his own people, he also gives relief to the Egyptians that fear him as well. So there's a different distinction that's here. And then Pharaoh, after all this happens, when he sees this hail, he sees this destruction, for the third time he says, pray for my people. Please end this. Pray to your Lord. And so Moses does. But Moses also says, you know what? I know that you still don't fear him. And the reason why is because the Bible specifically says only the flax and barley were destroyed. This is important because these were not the main sources of food. Wheat was the main source of food for the Egyptians. That was not yet destroyed because it hadn't ripened yet. But it will be destroyed. What we're seeing here in this text is the reason why Pharaoh could still harden his heart was because he wasn't completely crippled yet. He still knew that his people still had food. He still had that one card. It's going to be taken away next week. We'll see that. But this is the reason why Pharaoh still hardened his heart, even in the midst of all this destruction. So he hardens his heart yet again. This time it's Pharaoh hardening his heart, not the Lord hardening his heart. And this is what we see. So the main thing I want you to get from this is we are continually seeing throughout the plagues that God will go the distance. He will continue to go as far as he needs to for the sake of his people. We see that increasing every single plague. It started off with some minor annoyances, but now we are seeing things getting destroyed and crippled. The economy is messed up. Religion is messed up. Now they have very little food, right? It's going to continue to increase. But brothers and sisters, what we already know from the New Testament is God went the full distance in giving us his Son. And I'll continue to emphasize that because we'll see that in the Passover lamb. God will go the distance for his people. He is willing. Now at the same time, when destructive things are used, even in the midst of this destruction, you still see the hardening of hearts, right? Now, I'm going to take a very quick aside. So just bear in mind, this isn't from the text. This is something else. But basically, it's kind of come to my attention that we as sometimes for us in our own community, we tend to be more destructive with each other than we should be. And what I mean by this is we're not always very wise with how we use our words. And so we sometimes forget how destructive some of the things that we say can be. Now, granted, you can blame it on I come from a sarcastic background. We're making fun of each other is an art form, and you don't really appreciate the amount of depth that's involved in cutting down each other. I come from that background as well. I'm from the East Coast. This is how we get along. We make fun of each other. But at the same time, I think what was brought to my attention is that sometimes we go too far. And sometimes we say things that we really shouldn't, and it does more damage than good. And so I say this understanding that in many ways I'm the one who kind of starts this process. So I say this with my own realization that I have a lot to repent of this. But what I was reminded of when this was brought up to me, and as I looked through this passage and I saw the destruction and how at the end of the day, Pharaoh's heart was still hardened, right? Destruction only brings hardness. It only brings division, right? And so what I'm asking for us today is, let's choose higher ground, right? Let's choose to err on the side of maybe being too loving, if that's even possible, right? Like too encouraging, like, whoa, stop encouraging me so much. Like think about what kind of culture that is versus like where we're cutting each other down all the time. So different. And so what I'm encouraging all of us to, including myself, is let's seek to be people that lift each other up and build each other up rather than tearing each other down. Because there's a lot more fruit to that. When we build a community that is centered in love, there's so many more things that happen from that. So please, do this with me, even in our cacao room, which is the source for a lot of this. But even when we say in person, like these are things that when we speak life, it makes a bigger difference. It makes a bigger imprint, rather than we cut each other down. So brothers and sisters, to kind of cap all this up is trust. We're in a point, like brothers and sisters, as much as I love history, I can also tell you, history never stops, right? We are in a very critical point of history, I truly believe. Even when I think about my own lifetime, you can write a history book of what's happened in the past few decades. It's crazy, if you really think about the things that have happened. But it's going to continue to happen. And what I want to tell you, brothers and sisters, is regardless of whatever power comes up, whatever it is, just trust in God. Let Him do what He's going to do. Be faithful to what He has placed before you. And at the end of the day, rather than being part of the destructive things that are going on, let's choose instead to love, to build up, to encourage, knowing that ultimately what freed us, what allows us to come into a relationship with God, was the greatest act of love. Jesus Christ dying for us on the cross. Let's take some time to pray. Close for today. Let's just take a moment to allow God to remind us who He is, and that ultimately He is in control. So if we're in a position where we've been trying to orchestrate things, where we have all these ambitions and plans, and we are basically asking God